The anesthesia was wearing off when I heard the whispered conversation outside my hospital room. "Where is everyone?" I asked the nurse weakly. She looked uncomfortable before answering. "Your mother told the family to go home during your emergency surgery. She said you would be fine." My blood ran cold. While I was fighting for my life during a ruptured appendix that had gone septic, my own mother had dismissed my family, leaving me completely alone. That moment shattered everything I believed about unconditional love and family loyalty forever. Hey, everyone. Before we dive into this absolutely shocking family betrayal story, I want to know, where are you watching from today? If you have ever experienced family drama that left you questioning everything, you are definitely going to want to hear this one. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. And trust me, you do not want to miss what my so-called loving mother did next. My name is Serafina, and before that hospital room revelation, I genuinely believed I had won the family lottery. Growing up, my mother, Patricia, had always positioned herself as the ultimate maternal figure, the one who made elaborate birthday parties, who remembered every school event, who seemed to live and breathe for her children's happiness. She was the mother other kids envied, the one who baked cookies for every school function and never missed a soccer game. But lying in that sterile hospital bed, machines beeping around me, I started remembering things differently. The nurse, a kind woman named Margaret, had been taking care of me through the night shift. When she mentioned that my mother had sent everyone away, something in her tone suggested this was not normal family behavior. I pressed her for details, and what she told me made my stomach drop faster than my blood pressure during surgery. "Your mother came in while you were in the operating room," Margaret explained gently. "Your father, 2 brothers, sister, and even your grandmother had driven hours to be here. They were all in the waiting room, absolutely beside themselves with worry. When the doctor came out to explain that your appendix had ruptured and you had developed sepsis, they were devastated. But your mother..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What did she do exactly?" I whispered, though part of me already knew I did not want to hear the answer. "She told them that you were being dramatic, that appendix surgery was routine, and that everyone should go home because you would milk the attention for days if they stayed. She said, and I quote, 'Trust me, I know my daughter. She will be absolutely fine and she does not need all this fuss.' Your father tried to argue, but she was very insistent. She convinced them that staying would only encourage your attention-seeking behavior." The words hit me like a physical blow. Attention-seeking behavior during emergency surgery while fighting sepsis that could have killed me. As Margaret continued her rounds, I lay there replaying my entire childhood through this new, horrifying lens. Suddenly, countless incidents began making sense in the worst possible way. The time I broke my arm at age 12 and my mother insisted I was exaggerating the pain until the bone was visibly protruding. The severe food poisoning episode when I was 16 that she dismissed as me trying to skip school even as I was vomiting blood. The countless times she had minimized my feelings, my pain, my legitimate concerns as drama or attention-seeking. But this was different. This was not just dismissing my feelings or downplaying my pain. This was actively sabotaging my support system during a life-threatening medical emergency. This was ensuring that I would wake up alone believing that my family did not care enough to stay with me during surgery. I started thinking about the family dynamics I had always accepted as normal. My mother was the central figure, the one everyone deferred to, the one whose opinions shaped how everyone else reacted to situations. She was the information gatekeeper, the one who decided what was important and what was not, who needed support and who was being overdramatic. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she had been systematically isolating me from the rest of the family for years. She would tell my father that I did not want him at my college graduation because I was embarrassed by him. She would tell my brothers that I thought they were too immature to handle my problems, so there was no point in them trying to help. She would tell my sister that I preferred to handle things alone and found her advice annoying. All lies. Carefully constructed lies designed to make me believe my family did not care about me while simultaneously convincing them that I did not want their support. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Honey, I hope the surgery went well. Mom said you did not want visitors and that everything was routine. Call when you feel up to it." The casual tone of the message confirmed everything Margaret had told me. They genuinely believed I was fine, that this was no big deal, that I did not want them there. I realized that my mother had created a version of me in everyone's minds, a dramatic attention-seeking person who exaggerated every problem and pushed away help when she really needed it. She had spent years crafting this narrative so thoroughly that when I was actually in danger, nobody questioned her decision to send them home. The worst part was that she had made herself look like the caring, devoted mother in the process. She was the one who stayed. She was the one who handled everything. She was the one who protected the family from my supposed manipulation and drama. She had positioned herself as both my caretaker and their protector, creating a dynamic where she controlled every interaction I had with the people who should have loved me most. As the hours passed and the pain medication began to wear off, I felt something I had never experienced before, pure crystalline clarity about who my mother really was. Not the devoted parent I had spent 28 years believing in, but a master manipulator who had built her entire identity around controlling her family's perception of reality. The woman who had made such a show of being the perfect mother had systematically destroyed my relationships with everyone else in my family, ensuring that I would always need her while believing that nobody else truly cared about me. She had created a situation where I was isolated and dependent, where she was the only constant source of support, making her abandonment during my medical emergency even more devastating. But now I knew the truth. And more importantly, I was finally ready to do something about it. The next morning brought more than just shift change, nurses, and terrible hospital coffee. It brought my mother, Patricia, sweeping into my room like she was arriving at a charity gala she was hosting. She carried fresh flowers, wore her best concerned mother expression, and immediately began fussing over my blankets and adjusting my pillows. "Oh, sweetheart, how are you feeling? I stayed here all night, of course, sleeping in that awful chair. The nurses kept trying to send me home, but I told them that is just not how I operate when my daughter needs me." She smoothed my hair with practiced maternal gestures. "I sent everyone else home because you know how your father gets in hospitals. He would have been pacing and making everyone nervous, and your brothers would have been on their phones the whole time anyway. I knew you would want just me here for now." Watching her performance while knowing the truth felt like witnessing a master class in manipulation. Every word was carefully chosen, every gesture calculated to reinforce the narrative she had spent decades constructing. She was the devoted mother. Everyone else was inadequate or selfish. I was delicate and needed her specific brand of protection. But something had fundamentally shifted in my brain during those hours alone. Maybe it was the brush with death. Maybe it was the clarity that comes from being completely betrayed by someone you trust absolutely. But I found myself studying her like a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. "Mom," I said carefully, "the nurse mentioned that everyone was here during surgery. That must have been overwhelming for you to manage." "Oh, honey, you know how dramatic your family gets. Your grandmother was practically having a panic attack in the waiting room, going on about how she should have insisted you see a doctor sooner. Your father was interrogating every medical professional about infection rates and surgical complications. It was honestly more stressful than your actual surgery." She laughed, a tinkling sound that had always seemed warm but now felt calculated. "I knew the best thing was to send them home so you could recover in peace." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that if I had not already known the truth, I would have thanked her for protecting me from my supposedly neurotic family members. Instead, I nodded sympathetically and began planning. You are probably right. I am sure they would have been hovering and asking the nurses a million questions. I paused, then added casually, I should probably call Dad and let him know I am okay. He sent such a sweet text. A micro expression flashed across her face, surprise annoyance calculation, before being replaced by warm approval. Of course, sweetheart, though you know how he worries unnecessarily. Maybe just send a quick text saying you are fine. No need to get into all the medical details and scare him. There it was. The subtle but unmistakable attempt to control even this basic communication with my father. She wanted to maintain her position as the information gatekeeper, the one who decided what my family knew about my life and when they knew it. I spent the rest of her visit playing the role she expected. Grateful, slightly helpless, dependent on her superior judgment about family management. But internally, I was cataloging every manipulation technique, every subtle lie, every way she positioned herself as indispensable while undermining my relationships with everyone else. After she left to handle some insurance paperwork, which I suspected was actually a trip to craft the official family narrative about my surgery, I began making phone calls. Not to confront anyone, but to gather information. I needed to understand the full scope of what she had done and how long she had been doing it. My first call was to my sister Emma. Hey, Em, I just wanted to thank you for thinking of me yesterday, even though I know Mom said I did not want visitors. Wait, what? Emma's confusion was immediate and genuine. Sarah, Mom never said anything about you not wanting visitors. She said you were having routine surgery and that the hospital had strict visitor limits because of some infection control protocol. She said she was the only one allowed to stay because she was your primary emergency contact. My heart started racing. The lies were even more elaborate than I had realized. Did Dad try to stay anyway? Are you kidding? He was ready to camp out in the parking lot, but Mom showed him some official-looking paperwork about the visitor restrictions and convinced him that trying to stay would actually create problems for you with the hospital administration. Emma paused. Sarah, what is going on? Was Mom lying about the visitor restrictions? I made a split-second decision that would change everything. I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise not to say anything to anyone else until I figure out how to handle this. Can you do that? You are scaring me, but yes, what happened? I told her everything. The nurse's revelations, the real conversation in the waiting room, the pattern of manipulation I was beginning to recognize. By the time I finished, Emma was crying. Oh my God, Sarah. Oh my God. How many times has she done this? How many times have we thought you did not want us around when actually she was keeping us away? Emma's voice cracked. I always wondered why you seemed so distant sometimes, why you never seemed to want family support during hard times. I thought maybe we had done something wrong or that you just preferred handling things alone. I always wanted you guys there, I whispered. I just thought you did not want to be bothered with my problems. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the magnitude of what this meant. Then Emma said something that made my blood run cold. Sarah, if she has been doing this to you, who else has she been doing it to? What other relationships has she sabotaged? What other crises has she managed by keeping us apart? That was when I realized this was not just about me. This was about our entire family system, carefully orchestrated by a woman who had built her identity around being needed, being central, being the only one capable of managing everyone else's relationships and emotions. I was not just the victim of her manipulation. I was potentially the key to exposing a decades-long pattern of family sabotage that had affected all of us in ways we were only beginning to understand. And I was going to make sure she paid for every single lie she had ever told. The investigation that followed was like peeling back layers of an onion, except instead of tears, each layer revealed more devastating betrayals. Emma became my co-conspirator, and together we started carefully questioning other family members without revealing what we had discovered. What we found was a masterpiece of long-term manipulation that would have impressed a psychological warfare expert. Our first breakthrough came when I called my brother Marcus to thank him for the flowers he had supposedly sent to my hospital room. "What flowers?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Mom said you specifically did not want flowers because they trigger your allergies and that you would be upset if anyone sent them." "I do not have flower allergies. I have never had flower allergies. But somehow my mother had convinced my brother that I did, preventing him from making what would have been a natural gesture of care during my recovery." Emma decided to test our growing theory by calling our youngest brother Jake about a completely unrelated incident from 6 months ago when I had been dealing with a difficult breakup. "Remember when Sarah was going through that rough patch with David? I felt so bad that she did not want to talk to any of us about it." "What do you mean?" Jake sounded confused. "I tried to call her like 5 times, but Mom said Sarah had specifically asked family to give her space to work through it alone. Mom said Sarah felt like we would all just tell her what she wanted to hear instead of giving her honest advice, so she was handling it with her therapist instead." Another lie. I had desperately wanted family support during that breakup, but every time I had mentioned it to my mother, she had discouraged me from burdening everyone else with my relationship drama. She had positioned herself as my sole confidant while simultaneously telling everyone else that I had requested space. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. For years, probably decades, my mother had been systematically intercepting and redirecting every attempt at connection between me and the rest of our family. She had created parallel narratives, telling me that they did not want to be bothered telling them that I did not want their involvement, all while positioning herself as the devoted intermediary who was protecting everyone from unnecessary drama. But Emma's next discovery was what turned my sadness into fury. She had been thinking about our cousin Rebecca's wedding 3 years ago, specifically about why I had seemed so distant and antisocial at the reception. Emma decided to call Rebecca directly and ask about the seating arrangements, claiming she was planning her own wedding and wanted advice. "Oh, that whole thing was so awkward," Rebecca said immediately. "I really wanted Sarah at the head table with the rest of the family, but your mother called me a few weeks before the wedding and explained that Sarah was going through some mental health struggles and had specifically requested to be seated away from the family table. She said Sarah was feeling overwhelmed by family attention and needed space, but that she did not want anyone to make a big deal about it because she was embarrassed." Emma went silent. I had been seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends I barely knew, feeling hurt and excluded, believing that Rebecca had not considered me close enough for the family table. Meanwhile, Rebecca had spent the entire reception worried about my supposed mental health crisis and trying to respect boundaries I had never actually set. "Rebecca," Emma said carefully, "did my mother say anything else about Sarah's mental health?" "Well, she mentioned that Sarah had been having some ongoing anxiety issues and was in therapy, but that she did not want family members to know because she was worried about being judged. Your mom asked me to keep an eye on her during the reception, but not to make it obvious, and definitely not to bring up anything about therapy or mental health directly. I have never been in therapy. I have never had diagnosed anxiety issues. But my mother had created an entire fictional mental health narrative to explain away my supposed antisocial behavior that was actually the result of her systematically isolating me from family events and relationships. The most chilling part was how she had used mental health stigma as a weapon. She knew that Rebecca would be sympathetic and discreet about someone struggling with anxiety. She had weaponized kindness and understanding, turning them into tools of isolation. Emma and I decided we needed to go deeper. We created a shared document and started systematically cataloging every family interaction either of us could remember where something had seemed off. where someone's behavior had not quite made sense, where there had been hurt feelings or misunderstandings that had never been properly resolved. The picture that emerged was terrifying in its comprehensiveness. My father's 65th birthday party 2 years ago, where I had not given a speech because my mother told me the family thought my speeches were too long and sentimental and that everyone would prefer to keep things light and casual. Meanwhile, she had told my father that I was too busy with work to prepare remarks, making him feel like I did not prioritize his milestone birthday. My grandmother's funeral, where I had left early because my mother said the family needed space to grieve privately, and that my presence was making some relatives uncomfortable. In reality, my early departure had hurt several family members who interpreted it as me not caring enough to stay for the full service. The family vacation to Colorado, where I had stayed in a separate cabin because my mother said the main house was overcrowded and that I had volunteered to take the smaller space to help out. The truth was that my siblings had specifically requested that I stay with them in the main house, but my mother had told them I preferred privacy and did not enjoy family group activities. Every single instance involved her positioning herself as either the bearer of my supposed preferences or the protector of everyone else's feelings. She was always the reasonable middle person managing family dynamics and preventing conflict. Except the conflict she was preventing was genuine connection, and the management she was providing was systemic isolation disguised as consideration. The scope of her deception was breathtaking. She had not just manipulated individual interactions, she had constructed and maintained an alternate reality where I was antisocial, mentally fragile, work-obsessed, and uncomfortable with family intimacy. She had spent years teaching my family to read my behavior through this false lens so that even when I was actually reaching out or trying to connect, they interpreted it as obligation or politeness rather than genuine desire for relationship. But Emma discovered something that changed everything from investigation to war. She found a group text chain between our parents and our Aunt Linda from 6 months ago, where my mother had discussed concerns about my increasing isolation and possible depression. Text chain included detailed discussions about whether they should stage an intervention with my mother, ultimately advising against it, because she believed I would react poorly to feeling ganged up on, and that she was better positioned to handle my mental health crisis privately. They had been planning to intervene in my supposed mental health crisis. My family had been genuinely worried about me discussing strategies to help me, wondering whether they should insist I get professional help. All based on lies my mother had told them about my mental state and behavior. The cruelest part was that she had made herself the hero of this narrative too. She was the devoted mother who was protecting her fragile daughter from family pressure while managing everyone else's concerns. She was the one making sacrifices, handling the difficult conversations, bearing the emotional burden of my supposed struggles. She had created a version of reality where she was simultaneously my greatest advocate and my family's most trusted advisor about how to handle me. She had positioned herself as indispensable to everyone while making sure I remained isolated from genuine support. But now Emma and I had documentation. We had a pattern, and we had a plan that would expose 28 years of lies in one devastating conversation that would change our family forever. The woman who had built her entire identity around being needed was about to discover what happened when her victims finally compared notes. We scheduled the family meeting for Sunday dinner, the same weekly tradition where my mother had orchestrated decades of manipulation. Emma and I had spent 2 weeks documenting everything, reaching out to extended family members, and gathering evidence of the elaborate web of lies that had shaped our family dynamics for my entire adult life. The hardest part was maintaining normal interactions with my mother during those 2 weeks. Every phone call where she subtly discouraged me from attending a family event, every casual comment about how someone else was too busy to include me, every instance of her positioning herself as my interpreter to the rest of the family, It all took on a sinister quality now that I understood what she was actually doing, but I played my role perfectly. The slightly dependent daughter who relied on her mother's superior social intelligence to navigate family relationships. The grateful recipient of her protection from family members who supposedly found me difficult or demanding. I fed her exactly the responses she expected while internally documenting each manipulation attempt. The Sunday dinner started normally enough. My father grilled his famous ribs, my brothers argued about football. Emma helped my mother set the table while making light conversation about work and weekend plans. I arrived exactly on time, bringing the dessert I always contributed, playing the part of the slightly distant but reliably present family member. After dinner, as everyone settled into the living room with coffee and dessert, Emma stood up and cleared her throat. Actually, before we all scatter, Sarah and I have something we need to discuss with everyone. The shift in the room was immediate. My mother's smile became more focused, more controlled. She was already calculating, trying to anticipate what might be coming and how to manage it. "Of course, sweetheart," she said warmly. "What's on your minds?" I stood up next to Emma, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "I want everyone to know what really happened during my emergency surgery 3 weeks ago." My father looked confused. "What do you mean Mom told us everything went fine and that you needed rest?" "Dad, that's not what happened." I looked directly at my mother as I continued. "While I was in surgery, fighting for my life because my appendix had ruptured and I had developed sepsis, Mom told all of you that I was having routine surgery and that I didn't want visitors. She sent you home telling you that I would be fine and that staying would only encourage my attention-seeking behavior." The silence in the room was deafening. My mother's face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise calculation, and then a bright, concerned smile. "Honey, I think the medication might have confused your memory. I never said anything about attention-seeking. I told everyone that the hospital had strict visitor policies and that you needed rest. I stayed with you the entire time." "No, Mom, you didn't." Emma pulled out her phone. "We have documentation of everything you said, and we've been talking to other family members about other situations where your stories didn't add up." Marcus leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" Emma began reading from our shared document. Each incident, each lie, each time my mother had positioned herself as the bridge between me and the rest of the family while actually creating isolation and distance. The flower allergies I don't have, the mental health crisis she invented, the family events where she convinced everyone I wanted distance while telling me they didn't want me there. With each revelation, I watched my family's faces change. Confusion turned to recognition, turned to horror as they began understanding the scope of what had been done to all of us. Jake was the first to break. "Mom, is this true? Did you tell Sarah we didn't want to help her during the breakup with David because I called you specifically asking how I could support her, and you said she'd asked for space from family?" "And Rebecca's wedding," my father added quietly. "You told me Sarah was going through a hard time and needed to sit separately, but that we shouldn't make a big deal about it. You said she was embarrassed about her anxiety issues." My grandmother, who had been silent through most of the revelations, suddenly spoke up. "Patricia, what about when Sarah left my husband's funeral early? You said she was uncomfortable with displays of grief and that she felt the family was being too emotional. I spent months thinking my granddaughter didn't care enough about her grandfather to stay for his full service." Each family member began connecting dots, remembering interactions that hadn't quite made sense, hurt feelings that had never been properly addressed, times when they'd thought I was being distant or antisocial when actually I'd been responding to lies my mother had told me about their feelings. My mother tried several different strategies. First, she attempted to reframe everything as misunderstandings or miscommunications. Then she tried to suggest that I was having some kind of mental health crisis that was causing me to misinterpret her well-meaning attempts to protect family harmony. Finally, she attempted to position herself as the victim, saying that she'd been trying so hard to keep everyone happy that sometimes she'd gotten confused about who had said what. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emma and I had documentation going back years. We had text messages, recorded conversations, testimonies from extended family members who had been unknowing participants in her manipulation schemes. The moment everything changed was when my father asked a simple question. "Patricia, why? Why would you do this to our family?" For the first time in my life, I saw my mother without her mask. The warm, concerned expression disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. Because someone had to manage this family. Someone had to make sure everyone wasn't constantly hurt by everyone else's selfishness and drama. I was protecting all of you from each other. By lying to us, Marcus demanded. By keeping us apart. By managing the situation before it became a problem. She snapped. Sarah has always been dramatic and needy. If I'd let her lean on all of you every time she had a crisis, she would have burned out your patience years ago. And if I'd let you all hover over her constantly, she never would have learned to be independent. The room erupted. Everyone began talking at once, voices raised, accusations flying. But through the chaos, I heard my mother say something that crystallized everything. I built this family. I held it together for 30 years. Without me managing everyone's emotions and relationships, this family would have fallen apart decades ago. She genuinely believed that our family existed because of her manipulation, that love and connection were finite resources that needed to be carefully managed and distributed, that people were incapable of caring for each other without her intervention and control. She had convinced herself that isolating me from my family was an act of love, that lying to everyone was a form of protection, that destroying authentic relationships was actually preserving them. But now everyone could see what she really was. Someone who had built her entire identity around being indispensable, who had created problems so she could solve them, who had damaged her own family to maintain her position at the center of it. The woman who thought she had built our family was about to watch it rebuild itself without her. The immediate aftermath was worse than I had anticipated and more liberating than I had dared to hope. My mother left that Sunday dinner in a fury, claiming that we were all being manipulated by my mental health issues, and that we would regret destroying the family stability she had worked so hard to create. She insisted that everyone would come crawling back to her when they realized how much work it actually took to maintain healthy family relationships without her guidance. She was wrong about almost everything, but she was right about one thing. Rebuilding authentic relationships after decades of manipulation was incredibly difficult work. The first few weeks were chaos. My father moved into a hotel while he processed what my mother's behavior meant for their 35-year marriage. Emma and I spent hours on the phone with various family members, working through years of hurt feelings and misunderstandings that now made sense in a completely different context. Marcus called me crying after he realized that the reason I'd seemed uninterested in his promotion 3 years ago wasn't because I didn't care about his career. It was because my mother had told me he thought I was jealous of his success and preferred to keep his work achievements separate from family conversations. Meanwhile, she'd told him that I was going through a difficult time and that talking about his promotion would make me feel worse about my own career stagnation. Jake discovered that his perception of me as antisocial and work-obsessed came from years of my mother explaining my absence from family events as career-focused choices when actually she'd been discouraging my attendance by telling me that everyone thought I was too stressed and needed space. Every family member had a similar awakening. Years of believing they understood my personality, my preferences, my feelings about them, all based on lies my mother had carefully constructed and maintained. But the most devastating discovery came when we started talking to extended family. My Aunt Linda revealed that my mother had been running a similar operation with her side of the family for decades. She'd been telling them that my father's family thought they were too involved, while telling my father's family that my mother's side found them overwhelming. She'd been managing holiday celebrations, gift exchanges, and family gatherings by creating artificial boundaries and preferences that kept everyone slightly separated and dependent on her for information about what everyone else wanted. My cousin Rebecca broke down when she realized that the distance between our families over the past 10 years hadn't been natural drift. It had been systematically orchestrated by my mother, who had convinced both sides that the other side preferred less frequent contact. The scope of her manipulation extended far beyond just my immediate family. She had been the spider at the center of a web that included aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends. She had shaped dozens of relationships by controlling the flow of information between people who cared about each other. My father filed for divorce 6 weeks after our family meeting. The legal process revealed financial manipulation that paralleled the emotional abuse. My mother had been controlling family finances in ways that kept everyone dependent on her approval for major purchases and decisions, creating artificial scarcity and conflict where none needed to exist. But while my mother's world was crumbling, something beautiful was happening with the rest of us. For the first time in my adult life, I was having direct conversations with my family members about my actual thoughts, feelings, and experiences. No intermediary, no carefully managed information, no protective filters. Just honest, sometimes messy, always authentic communication. Marcus and I started having weekly phone calls where we actually talked about our lives, our struggles, our successes. I learned that he'd been worried about me for years, but had been told that reaching out would make me feel pressured. He learned that I'd been proud of his achievements, but had been convinced that expressing that pride would make him think I was needy and attention-seeking. Emma and I became closer than we'd ever been united, not just by our shared discovery, but by our commitment to building the kind of sister relationship we'd been prevented from having. We started planning trips together, sharing daily life details, asking each other for advice, all things that had been subtly discouraged for years by a mother who wanted to be our primary source of support and guidance. My father began opening up about his own experiences of feeling like he could never quite connect with his children the way he wanted to. He'd spent years believing that we found him embarrassing or overwhelming when actually my mother had been managing his interactions with us to maintain her position as our primary parent. Even my grandmother, now in her 80s, experienced a renewal of family relationships as she realized that her sense of growing distance from her grandchildren had been artificially created by her daughter-in-law's careful management of family dynamics. The healing process wasn't smooth or simple. There were arguments, hurt feelings that couldn't be easily resolved, even with understanding and awkward moments, as we all learned how to relate to each other without my mother's interpretation and mediation. But there was also laughter, genuine connection, and the deep satisfaction of finally understanding family dynamics that had never quite made sense before. Inside jokes that actually included everyone's spontaneous gatherings that happened because people wanted to see each other rather than because someone felt obligated, and honest conversations about difficult topics without someone managing the emotional temperature of every interaction. My mother made several attempts to regain control during this period. She tried individual manipulation with different family members, claiming that everyone else was being unreasonable and that she was the only one who really understood the situation. She attempted to create new crises that would require her intervention. She even tried to position herself as the victim of an unfair family conspiracy. None of it worked. Once we'd seen the pattern, we couldn't unsee it. Once we'd experienced authentic connection with each other, we couldn't go back to accepting her managed version of family relationships. The most telling moment came when she showed up uninvited to Emma's birthday celebration, expecting to resume her role as the family coordinator who made sure everyone felt included and comfortable. Instead, she found herself faced with a family that was functioning perfectly well without her, laughing together, supporting each other, resolving minor conflicts directly instead of through her mediation. She left early, claiming she felt unwelcome, but really she left because she was confronted with the reality that her family didn't need her manipulation to love each other. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what healthy family love looked like, and it was nothing like what she'd been providing. 1 year after that devastating Sunday dinner, I was getting ready for my father's wedding to a wonderful woman named Catherine, who had helped him understand that healthy relationships don't require constant management and interpretation. As I adjusted my bridesmaid dress, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since exposing my mother's decades of manipulation. The most profound change was in my daily experience of family relationships. Instead of carefully navigating complex emotional protocols managed by my mother, I now had direct, authentic connections with people who actually knew me. Marcus had become one of my closest friends, someone I texted daily and turned to for advice about everything from career decisions to dating choices. Emma and I had taken 3 trips together, discovering that we shared similar senses of humor and life philosophies that had been hidden under years of managed interactions. My relationship with my father had blossomed into something I'd never known was possible. Without my mother filtering every interaction and managing his access to information about my life. He'd revealed himself to be genuinely interested in my thoughts, funny in ways I'd never noticed, and incredibly supportive of my independence. The man I'd been told was too overwhelming and judgmental turned out to be patient, thoughtful, and eager to know his daughter as an actual person rather than through someone else's interpretation. But the most satisfying transformation was in my extended family relationships. My grandmother and I had started a tradition of monthly lunch dates where she shared family history and stories that my mother had never passed along, claiming they would be boring or overwhelming for me. Rebecca and I had reconnected to the point where she'd asked me to be her maid of honor in her second wedding, a role my mother had convinced her I wouldn't want because I was uncomfortable with public attention. The family gatherings themselves had become completely different experiences. Instead of carefully orchestrated events where everyone's interactions were managed and monitored, we now had genuine celebrations full of spontaneous conversations and side jokes that actually included everyone and the comfortable chaos that comes from people who trust each other enough to be authentic. My mother had made several attempts to regain her position during that first year. She'd tried individual manipulation with different family members, spinning elaborate stories about being misunderstood and unfairly blamed. She'd attempted to create new crises that would require her intervention, including a fabricated health scare designed to make everyone feel guilty for excluding her. She'd even hired a family therapist to mediate what she claimed was a misunderstanding that professional guidance could resolve. None of it worked because we'd all learned to verify information independently instead of accepting her version of events. When she told Jake that Emma was upset with him about something, he called Emma directly. When she told my father that I was struggling with depression and needed intervention, he called me himself. When she claimed that various family members were saying negative things about each other, we'd simply ask each other directly. The transparency was revolutionary. For the first time in my adult life, I knew that when family members said they loved me, supported me, or wanted to spend time with me, they actually meant it rather than saying it because someone had told them they should. My mother's isolation became increasingly complete as family members realized they could have authentic relationships without her mediation. She'd built her entire identity around being needed, and now she was discovering what happened when people found out they could love each other directly without requiring her translation services. The final justice came in an unexpected form. My mother had always presented herself to friends and community members as the ideal family woman, someone whose children and extended family adored her and relied on her wisdom for managing their relationships. She'd built a social identity around being the person other mothers came to for advice about handling difficult family dynamics. But when word spread about what she'd actually been doing, and in our connected community word always spreads, That carefully constructed public image crumbled completely. Other families began questioning their own dynamics, wondering if the friend they'd turned to for advice about managing their children's relationships had actually been encouraging manipulation rather than healthy communication. Several families discovered their own smaller versions of what my mother had done to us. She'd been giving advice that encouraged parents to control information flow between family members, to position themselves as necessary intermediaries to create dependency rather than fostering authentic connections. Her influence had been poisonous far beyond just our family. The community that had once viewed her as a relationship expert now saw her as a cautionary tale. The social recognition she'd craved so desperately became social isolation as people realized her expertise had been in manipulation rather than genuine family building. As I watched my father and Catherine exchange vows, surrounded by family members who were there because they genuinely wanted to celebrate rather than because someone had convinced them they were obligated to attend, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete peace with my family relationships. There was no anxiety about whether people actually wanted me there, no second guessing about whether my contributions were welcome, no careful navigation of complex social protocols designed to keep me slightly separate from everyone else. I was simply a beloved family member, celebrating with other beloved family members, all of us present by choice and free to express our genuine feelings. The woman who had spent 28 years teaching me that family love was conditional, complicated, and required careful management had unintentionally given me the greatest gift possible: the contrast that allowed me to recognize authentic love when I finally experienced it. Watching my mother's isolation from across the church, she'd been uninvited to the wedding after attempting to convince several family members that my father was making a mistake and needed intervention. I felt something unexpected: gratitude. Her manipulation had been devastating but surviving. It had taught me to value genuine connection, to communicate directly instead of through intermediaries, to trust my own perceptions rather than accepting someone else's interpretation of reality. I'd learned that healthy relationships don't require management or translation, that love doesn't need to be rationed or controlled, and that families can function beautifully when people are allowed to care for each other authentically. The justice wasn't just that she'd lost her family, it was that we'd found each other. Have you ever discovered that someone close to you had been systematically sabotaging your relationships with others? How did you rebuild trust after realizing that your entire understanding of family dynamics had been shaped by lies? Sometimes the people who claim to be protecting us from drama are actually the ones creating it. If this story resonated with your own experiences with family manipulation, or if you've ever had to rebuild relationships after discovering betrayal, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please give this video a like if it opened your eyes to relationship patterns you might not have recognized before, and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction and finding authentic connections. Share this with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve genuine family relationships built on truth rather than manipulation. Thank you for listening to my journey from isolation to belonging. And remember, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop letting someone else control how you love each other.